Welcome back to another video where I make you question everything you thought you knew about SIBO. This is part 2 of an ongoing series examining the pros and cons and accuracy issues with SIBO breath tests. So in part 1, we talked about the rate of false positives with lactulose being incredibly high. In today's video, we're going to talk about the rate of false positives with glucose testing. And then in next week's video, we're going to talk about the rate of false negatives with glucose testing. So without further ado, let's get right into it, and I will share my slides. All right, so let's go ahead and make ourselves a little pro-con list. Let's weigh the pros and cons and talk about, first and foremost, false positives with glucose. Rough translation: if you've had a glucose SIBO test and it came back positive, how much weight can you put in that positive result? Is it really SIBO or is it something else? Well, let's get into it. And as I said in my previous video, I think the bulk of the research and the bulk of what people look at when we're discussing accuracy is comparing the breath tests to aspirate and culture results. And I'll share again that aspirate and culture is still considered the gold standard, but it is far from perfect. So there's issues with the location that it is sampled, right? If you sample from a location in the small bowel that doesn't have overgrowth and you miss the pocket that does have overgrowth, you could give a false diagnosis, a false negative diagnosis. About 80% of the gut microbiome is not culturable at all. So we are only culturing a very small portion of what came out of the small bowel when we do this. And to make matters worse, the cutoff value, the CFU per ml, is still widely debated, and it's been tinkered with and lowered over the years. I have an opinion on that. I'm sure a lot of people do. Let me know if you guys want me to do a full video on the accuracy issues and the pros and cons of aspirate and culture testing. I could do a video on that, but the way I figure it, this is more for people who are really in the weeds with the research, as opposed to normal people. I don't think a lot of you have had aspirate culture results necessarily, so I'm a little hesitant to put in the effort to do a big video on that, but if enough of you say, yeah, I want it, maybe I'll produce that at some point, because I certainly have opinions on that and a buttload of research. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and start by comparing glucose to the so-called gold standard. So here's that meta-analysis again that I mentioned in the previous video, and they said the sensitivity of glucose testing was 54% and the specificity is 83%. And if you know anything about statistics and sensitivity and specificity, this would give the illusion that false negatives are a big deal, but false positives really are not, right? Because it has pretty good specificity at 83%. But as we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides, I assure you that is not the case. Here's another one. This is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, duodenal aspirate versus culture, duodenal aspirate and culture versus glucose breath test. And they said duodenal culture was positive in 44.6% of subjects at the 10 to the third power CFU per ml range, and it was positive at 18% of subjects in the 10 to the fifth CFU per ml range. So this is what I was mentioning before briefly. The cutoff point to diagnose SIBO on aspirate is still pretty widely debated. For a long time, they would use 10 to the fifth or 10 to the sixth power. But in more recent years, probably the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a big push to use 10 to the third, which I think could be really problematic and overdiagnose SIBO. And then glucose clocks in right in the middle with about a 27.3% positivity rate. So it makes you question, all right, is the 10 to the third cutoff, are we setting the bar too low? And we're diagnosing people with SIBO when they in fact do not? Is the 10 to the fifth maybe a little bit too high and we're missing people with SIBO and glucose is the benchmark we should be shooting for? But this is the sort of stuff that comes up when we look at research looking at the accuracy of glucose. It's kind of a crapshoot, honestly. We don't know which of these cutoffs or which of these tests is superior, but this is the sort of stuff that you have to weigh when you're looking at research articles and meta-analyses. But here's another one. They said 19% of patients had SIBO based on the 10 to the fifth CFU per ml baseline, compared with 0 of the 10 controls. So that's good. So we're not telling anybody that they have SIBO when in fact they do not, right? So 0 out of 10 healthy controls are told that they have SIBO, and 27% of people have a positive glucose breath test. But what's fascinating, you might think, oh, the aspirin culture is underdiagnosing and glucose is actually correct. But the study design was bonkers, you guys. They used 100 grams of glucose, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But oh my God, that's a lot of glucose. The breath test was performed over 3 hours, which is way, way, way too long. That's about double the amount of time it should have been done. And they used a measly 12 part per million increase as the benchmark for considering a positive result. A lot of tests use a 20 part per million benchmark, just for reference. So there was a lot going on in the study that could have led to the overdiagnosis of SIBO based off of the glucose test. So the two assumptions in a wild card that I want to talk about here. Number one, similar to my previous video, the biggest assumption that we make with breath testing, the single biggest problem is this right here. And this paper said it beautifully, so I'm going to quote them again. They said early elevations can occur in two major circumstances. So making gas early on in that chart. So if you look back the left-hand side of that chart, number one, patients with rapid oral cecal transit, and two, people with SIBO. The critical issue with this test is the definition of an early elevation. What constitutes early? And they said a positive test cannot be interpreted properly without a concomitant test of oral cecal transit time. We're going to get to that in just a minute. So here's your digestive tract. Oral cecal transit time. Oral meaning mouth, cecal meaning cecum. That is the amount of time it takes the substrate, in this case glucose, to make it from your mouth, down your esophagus, to your stomach, through the duodenum, through the jejunum, through the ileum, and into the cecum, which is the first part of your colon. So there's your cecum. That's the area of interest. And the wild card is we have no idea how fast your oral cecal transit time is. You could be the tortoise, you could be the hare, you could be somewhere in between. And we have no stinking idea unless we've measured it with something called scintigraphy. So going back here to a breath test that might look like this, the lab gives you this rough cutoff of, to the left is the small intestine and to the right is the large intestine, and that's how you interpret this thing. Well, who says that that's where the line is? And is that true for everybody? Every single person on planet Earth is going to have that same delineation? I think not. That is absolutely not the case. And this is another one. I could do a video on this, but I'm going to gauge it off of your guys' response. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a video or two about basically determining if you have a fast or slow oral cecal transit time. That's not going to be as useful as you think it will be right now, but I could potentially have that conversation to give you a really, really quick and dirty idea of how useful your SIBO test is. Again, I think that is actually of limited use, believe it or not, but there is a lot of research on the things that speed up and slow down that marker. But I'm just here to tell you that cutoff point, that is not the same for every person, not even remotely close. So here, looking at this is a great article as a side note, the Guide to Appropriate Use of Breath Testing. It's fantastic. So number one assumption is that we are looking at a steady oral cecal transit time, and we can accurately predict when that sugar substrate makes it from the small intestine to the colon. That's problem numero uno. Problem two is that we all assume that glucose does not reach the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine, and that is actually not true. So they said, a major source of false positive hydrogen glucose breath test is the incomplete absorption of the test substrate within the small bowel, resulting in delivery of glucose to and subsequent fermentation in the colon. This was identified during the development of breath testing, in which patients with partial gastrectomy exhibited hydrogen production when more than 25 grams of glucose was ingested. 25 grams. 25. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Actually, as a side note, I'll just mention it here. The other wild card is that the amount of glucose in a SIBO test varies widely. Most commercial labs seem to use 75 or 80 grams of glucose, but again, we saw one research article that used 100 grams, and I've seen some research papers that use 50 grams. But here we're seeing that if any more than 25 grams of glucose is ingested, some of it gets malabsorbed. A subsequent case series identified a cohort of patients without surgical alterations of the gut who also had abnormal glucose breath test as a result of rapid oral cecal transit time delivering unabsorbed glucose to the cecum. Guys, this happens. This is a huge myth in the SIBO community that glucose doesn't reach the distal small intestine and therefore it's going to result in more false negatives. It's a hunk of baloney. No. This was a neat study. So this is only a couple years old. The safety and sensitivity of a telemetric capsule to monitor GI hydrogen production in healthy subjects. This was a pilot trial, and they compared it to breath tests. After a large dose of ingested glucose, 40 grams, which again, that's nothing compared to SIBO tests. After a large dose of ingested glucose, the capsule did detect hydrogen concentrations in the colon similar to those after 1.5 grams or 1.25 grams of inulin. This indicates that after a large bolus dose of glucose, some is malabsorbed. This finding has implications for the interpretation of results from glucose breath hydrogen testing, where after a 75-gram bolus of glucose, increase in breath hydrogen are considered indicative of SIBO. And keep in mind, again, this is a pilot trial in healthy people. This isn't even looking at people with presumed SIBO or IBS, in which case you would think that the incidence of malabsorption is probably higher than the general public. These are just regular Joe and Jane America type people, and even they have malabsorbed glucose reaching the colon. And maybe it's not malabsorbed at all. Maybe that's just that human physiology is not capable of soaking up that much glucose in one sitting, and maybe it's natural for that to make it to the colon. But you listen to the SIBO verse out there, and they would make you think that glucose doesn't even reach the ileum, let alone the cecum. Simply not true. And again, that was just to remind me to talk about the wild card with the amount of glucose that's used. Again, ranges from 50 to 100 grams, certainly enough to see this phenomenon. And again, it's common enough. I don't think it's a phenomenon at this point. So let's go ahead and talk about glucose breath tests with oral cecal transit studies called scintigraphy. So here's one. And they said 46 of the patients had abnormal breath test results. Based on scintigraphy findings, 22 of these patients, 48%, had false positive results, which were caused by colon fermentation of unabsorbed glucose. Here we've got it. So we've got about a 48% false positive rate with glucose breath testing. Yikes. Conclusion. Almost half of the positive results from glucose breath tests are false due to colonic fermentation. All patients with abnormal results from breath tests should be considered for confirmatory repeat breath testing with concurrent scintigraphy to distinguish SIBO from colonic fermentation. So concurrent, what that means is you would redo the breath test and they would put the radioactive isotope in the glucose, and that way they could do the scintigraphy study at the exact same time as the breath test. And that way the rationale is when you exhale for the test every 15 minutes or whatever it is, when you exhale, they also take an image of your intestines and your abdomen to see where that radioactive isotope is. And when they look back at the data and they see that there's a peak in hydrogen production, they could go back and look at the picture to see if that radioactive glucose made it to the colon yet. If it had already made it to the colon, that's not SIBO, that's just colonic fermentation. But if you have a peak in hydrogen production prior to the juice reaching the cecum, then that is what would be called true SIBO. So that's their recommendation. Even assuming a relatively rapid oral cecal transit of 30 minutes would have resulted in 1 out of 8 abnormal tests from colonic fermentation being mislabeled as SIBO, while nearly 1/4 of true SIBO patients would have been missed. All cases of true SIBO were detected by 60 minutes. However, nearly half of the abnormal breath tests before this time were due to colonic fermentation. So basically what they tried to do, they tried to answer the question, oh, okay, if rapid oral cecal transit time is the problem, maybe we just tighten up the range. Maybe instead of 180, 120, 90, 60, whatever minutes, all the labs are different. But maybe instead of putting the dividing line there, maybe we just scooch it over. Maybe we say you have SIBO if you have a peak in hydrogen production before 30 minutes. And even that is not perfect. You've really got to do the concurrent scintigraphy to make use out of breath testing. Without that, it's a total wild card. We have no idea if that substrate is getting fermented in the small bowel or the colon. But that's what we're all assuming when we do breath testing. The widely accepted definition of a positive breath test depends on a normal, quote unquote, oral cecal transit time of 90 minutes. Yet each of our patient groups had an average oral cecal transit time of less than 90 minutes, even those with negative breath test results. These results correlate well with prior studies of healthy patients, which have also shown oral cecal transit of less than 90 minutes. It is an error to assume that positive breath tests before 90 minutes must indicate SIBO. At the absolute minimum, and this is very imperfect, if I look at a breath test and try to make sense of it, the absolute maximum I'm willing to entertain is a 60-minute cutoff, which is what European guidelines currently recommend. But even 60 is far from perfect. So I'm still taking that with a huge grain of salt. But most labs and most doctors, in my finding, are basing the interpretation of the SIBO test results off of either 90 or 120 minutes, which is absolutely not supported by research. Now, interestingly, they said colon fermentation caused false positive results in 65% of patients who had undergone upper GI surgery and 13% of patients without prior surgery. The upper GI surgery patients had a shorter oral cecal transit time with 54 minutes as compared to non-surgery patients who had an average of 83 minutes. So this is particularly a problem in people who have had upper gut surgery. Now, I know you're going to ask in the comments, and I don't recall from the study. I don't remember how they defined upper gut surgery. I don't know. I don't think this would include endoscopy, but certainly if you have had surgery for hiatal hernia repair, or a gastric bypass, or a lap band, that sort of stuff, like any surgery where they're actually cutting into the stomach itself, that I think would classify as upper gut surgery. I don't remember if gallbladder removal or, like upper small intestine surgery would count for that. I think probably this is going to be people who have had like bariatric surgery, lap band, Roux-en-Y, gastric bypass, that sort of stuff. That's probably going to be the majority of these patients. But even in the non-surgical group, still a problem. And you're probably wondering what the heck to do, maybe left a little bit speechless. You might just be really bummed out. You might be sad right now. I'm feeling a little bit like this Elmo setting the world on fire. Here I am, the SIBO expert, and now I'm going to come across as the ultimate SIBO denier. I swear I'm not a SIBO denier. It's just that we have to use good testing if we're going to rely on this testing to inform our decision making. But right now I'm feeling a little bit like this. And really just what's on everybody's mind is, what do we do now? Like, okay, you presented all this cool information. Great. But what do I do now? How do I get better? So let me take my head off of head bubble mode. All right. And let's bring it in, gang. Let's bring it in, because I know you're bummed and overwhelmed and having a holy crap moment. And I knew that would happen, but also let me just give you a reframe, if I may. So right now, my guess is that a lot of you are very frustrated, very bummed out, because presumably you have felt like crap for a really long time. And a lot of you have had the situation where you go to doctors, you go to specialists, and everything looks normal. And then you get a SIBO breath test, and it's finally something. It's finally something to go off of, something positive. It tells you what's wrong for once. Oh my God. And it was this holy grail, like, moment for a lot of you. And you thought you had the answer. And most likely you clung to that answer with all your worth. And now here I am being the big meaty pie, taking that answer away from you. And you might feel like you're back at square one, wondering what the heck to do and how on earth you're going to feel better. So couple of things. I totally understand that point of view. And honestly, I probably would have felt that way if I watched this video and had a breath test when my gut was really bad. But the reframe is you no longer have to shackle yourself to the world of SIBO. You no longer have to stick with the world of killing and starving and killing and starving. You don't necessarily have to keep pumping the antimicrobials and the antibiotics, particularly if they're not working for you. I've met so many people where they try an antimicrobial or they try rifaximin and it does nothing for them, but they're convinced that they have SIBO, so they keep hitting it anyway. You don't have to do that. If the antimicrobials and the antibiotics have not worked for you, you don't have to keep taking them because there's a pretty significant likelihood that, in fact, you don't have SIBO. Similarly, if you've been on a restricted SIBO diet, you no longer have to shackle yourself to that. Just base it off of your symptoms and how you're feeling and the intuition in your body versus what some expert told you about starving the SIBO, which you may in fact not have. So just take a little bit of time, zoom out, and just look at your body and think, what does a human body need to be healthy? And go from there. We have episodes on the IBS Freedom podcast talking about this. I've got some videos on this channel, one in particular about, two in particular I think would interest you. One is what to do when you don't know your root cause. And number two, there's a more recent video titled Overcoming SIBO Without Antimicrobials. Those two videos I think would be really, really valuable for you right now. And I'm just sorry. I don't want to be the person who takes away the thing that you were clinging so hard to. But also, again, I'm hoping with a little bit of time, you can reframe this and see that this is a huge opportunity. And now you have this wonderful wide world of therapeutic options for you. And you no longer have to do the sucky treatment methods that you probably had been doing up until this point. Now, I know also most of you are going to be bummed. There's going to be a handful of you who go more like the anger direction. And you're going to be thinking, I'm full of baloney and I don't know what I'm talking about. Somehow somebody's going to say this. If you are feeling skeptical and you want to fact check me, what I've done, I'm going to put a link down below. I will send you a link to a Google Drive folder, where I have put every single research article I've read, every single PDF is in there, as well as my notes. Now they're kind of clusterfucky because this is just how I took these notes for me, not for you. But the big Word document, the 30+ page Word document with all of the notes, and I'll put in my PowerPoint slides. So if you want to fact check me and read the articles or read some of the highlighted notes that I have, you can go ahead and have at it. This is just to help you guys. So if you want to be a nerd, if you want to fact check me, go for the gold. I really, really think that this is a message that needs to get out into the SIBO community more so, because again, a lot of people are shackled to something that is not serving them. And if we can just tell those people that you can be free, you can work on other things now, you don't have to kill and starve. I think that that's a really sorely needed message in the SIBO space. If you feel like this was worth your while, if you would consider sharing this video on social media or somewhere in a forum or a group, I would deeply appreciate that. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the supposed rate of false negatives with glucose testing. That should give you a hint already. Supposed false negative issue with glucose. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.